Thank you all for joining us tonight for the book launch for Chappaqua resident Ronni Diamondstein's debut picture book biography, Jackie and the Books She Loved. Ronni has spent her life surrounded by books and immersed in the world of children's literature. As a school library media specialist and teacher of gifted and talented students in the US and abroad, Ronni nurtured her students' creativity by sharing her love of reading with them. Ronni served on the board of the Chappaqua Children's Book Festival and also on the board of the Chappaqua Library. And when she's not reading or writing, you may see Ronni around town with her toy poodle, Maggie May, though I understand Maggie May will not be joining us tonight because she's asleep.
Right. Yes, she's sleeping.
So thank you, Ronni, for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Robin. I really want to tell you how much I appreciate the staff of the Children's Room, you, Teresa, Mercy, and Julianne for your support and for working on this with me. I also want to thank the co-sponsors of this evening, the Friends of the Miller House, led by John Diaconis and Lynn Briggs. And I also want to thank the other co-sponsors, Skyhorse Press, which is the parent of Sky Pony, the publisher of Jackie and the Book She Loved, and particularly my editor, Nicole Frail, and the publicist, Rachel Marble. So, and now I think we want to hear the story, Jackie and the Book She Loved. So I'm going to share my screen.
Dive in.
And let's do this. Here we go. So Jackie and the Book She Loved, written by Ronni Diamondstein and illustrated by Bats Langley. A quote from Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis: "If you produce one book, you will have done something wonderful in your life." Little Jackie Bouvier learned to read at an early age. She kept her books in a pair of bookcases that her mother had given her for Christmas. She started a library of her own with many about ballet and filled the shelves in no time. Sometimes, when Jackie was supposed to be napping, she would spend time in the guest room where the grown-up books were kept and sat on the windowsill reading. Jackie had a vivid imagination and told people that a brown bear lived in her bedroom. She wrote and illustrated stories and poems, often about the family animals. There was The Adventures of George Woofty, Esquire, a spirited terrier, and a funny biography of General de Gaulle, a bored and blasé black poodle. Her mother collected Jackie's early writings, each piece in Jackie's firm, ornamental handwriting, and bordered with a drawing. The stories on thick white notepaper were tied together with bits of ribbon or brightly colored string. Every Wednesday after her dance class, Jackie visited her Grampy Jack Bouvier in his New York City apartment. The two would often memorize poems together, and he encouraged her to write her own. One of the poems she wrote was titled Sea Joy. "When I go down by the sandy shore, I can think of nothing I want more than to live by the booming blue sea as the seagulls flutter round about me. I can run about when the tide is out with the wind and the sand and the sea all about. And the seagulls are swirling and diving for fish. Oh, to live by the sea is my only wish." Jacqueline Bouvier, 1939. Jackie wrote birthday poems to her mother and father and for family anniversaries, but Jackie always loved reading the best. When she was 15, Jackie went off to Miss Porter's, an all-girls school. "Shh, I'm reading," she would tell her roommate Nancy while the other girls were talking. Jackie could be found in her room reading and writing poetry just as she had as a child. She even wrote stories and poems for the school newspaper. All of Jackie's hard work paid off as she got older. She won an essay contest for a fashion magazine when she was in college. The magazine editors loved her work, which was titled People I Wish I Had Known. Jackie had always been interested in history and decided she wanted to know people better. She thought that journalism would be a good way to do that. So, as an adult, she took a job in Washington, D.C. with a popular newspaper and went around town asking questions and taking pictures of people. She interviewed everyone from bus drivers and children to ballet dancers and VIPs, including her future husband, Senator John F. Kennedy. A love of reading was something Jackie had in common with John Kennedy. They both loved books so much that when she went to London for work, she came back with a super heavy suitcase jam-packed with books as a gift for him. Jackie married John F. Kennedy. They enjoyed reading and even writing together. Jackie encouraged him to write an award-winning book. Jackie helped him do the research for this book and even wrote down parts of it on lined yellow paper. Jackie's writing skills helped Senator Kennedy become president of the United States. The voters got to know him and his family through her weekly newspaper column, which helped him get the votes he needed. When President Kennedy took office, Jackie became the nation's first lady. She thought there should be something young people could take with them as a souvenir after visiting the White House. So she designed a White House guidebook, which she also edited. As a mother, she hoped that her love of books would inspire her children, Caroline and John, making them readers too. Sadly, President Kennedy died in 1963. After that, Jackie and her children eventually moved to New York City. Jackie encouraged Caroline and John to read great writers and poets. And as she had done as a child with her Grampy Jack, for each birthday or holiday, Caroline and John would write or choose a poem for their mother, illustrated and pasted in a special scrapbook. In 1975, Jackie got her first job in publishing, a perfect fit for a fan of reading and writing. She became a consulting editor for a publisher, but refused any special treatment in her small, windowless office. She answered the phone and sat on the floor laying out photos. In the summertime, she would work from her home on the island of Martha's Vineyard. Even though she was very famous, for Jackie, the author was the true star of the book. She made sure to stay in the background and let her authors shine. Jackie especially enjoyed editing books by young women writers. Many of her books address women's contributions to history. Jackie was ahead of her time. During her career in publishing, Jackie edited books for children of all ages, including whimsical tales, books about ballet, modern dance, Hollywood, French writers, pop stars, different cultures, and art. All were the things Jackie loved. She edited nearly 100 books, many of which were bestsellers. She loved having a career and showing her children how important it is to have work you are passionate about. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis had done many wonderful things in her life. She was most famous for being the First Lady of the United States, the wife and widow of President John F. Kennedy. But she made her mark as an editor. A love of literature guided her life. The books that she read and that she edited were her story. She never wanted to write a memoir. However, now her books are her legacy and have painted her self-portrait. And that's the end. And then I'm going to share the rest of the back matter, which is what happens when you want to tell everything in the narrative, but you really can't because you want to write a lyrical, lovely story, and then you pull out things. And we created a timeline of Jackie's life from her birth to her death with all the things in between. And then a very long note from this author who often has a lot to say, filling in a lot of the blanks, the things that we had to remove from the story, like a lot of the books that she liked to read as a child, and a little more information about her. And that was, we have 3 pages of that. Then the task of how do you decide of the nearly 100 books, what books to choose for a representative selection of titles of the books she edited. And you can see that here. I tried my best to give you an idea of the scope of what she wanted to, what she was interested in. So these titles, and then the selected sources. I have a vast collection of books about Jackie and did an amazing amount of research, but this was the main resources used for this book, and of course the source credits. And then I'm going to skip ahead. You know who those people are, Bats Langley and me. And I want to talk about the end papers, because anybody who knows me and follows me on, let me move back, on social media knows I love quotes. I post quotes every day about kindness and pictures of flowers and nature. And when I wrote the first version of this, I interspersed quotes throughout it because I envisioned it that way, but it didn't quite work out. And Nicole, my wonderful editor, said to me, what do you think we should do with the quote? So I thought, let's put them on the end papers. And knowing, as I do, that Jackie, she loved to write. She often wrote handwritten notes to people. And she used Smithson stationery, and powder blue was the color. So I suggested to Nicole that we do this. And these are some of the quotes that we, about her being a writer. And why do I keep doing that? I'm so sorry. And so that's the story of that. So I think that now I'll stop sharing my screen, Robin, and we will have some questions.
Yes, I have a variety of questions that I want to ask you, but I will remind folks that you are also encouraged to send in questions to the chat or through the Q&A, and I'll be keeping an eye on those. But I'm going to start with my questions because as a children's librarian, I particularly appreciated how you highlight Jackie's interest in children reading, from the way that she encourages her own children to the White House guidebook that she wrote, and the picture books that she edited during her career. So what do you hope that kids today will learn from Jackie?
Well, I, as a librarian also, Robin, and somebody that reading and books have been my life's work, just like it is yours. I, of course, I'm hopeful that they'll want to read and be inspired to read, inspired to write. But there's more to this story than that. I think the thread in here is like, this was a passion of hers. And I want children to make that connection of, following your passion and ultimately doing something that gives you joy. I know that, I'm sure, I don't know because I didn't ask her, but I'm sure that she got great pleasure out of bringing these books into the world. And the other connection I'd like to make, and I've kind of reinforced by the comments I've gotten from people who've read the book with children just in the last couple of days, the personal connection that children can make to this story. Do they have a grandparent that they do something with? It doesn't necessarily have to be writing poems. They could go fishing with their grandfather, or grandmother, or bake with them. And also, do they, those kind of connections, and do they have their own little library, like Jackie had a little collection of books? And do they write poems, stories, and things for themselves? I was a child who always wrote stories. So, I think and as a teacher too, that's when we read to children, we want them to make connections. And that's what I'm really hoping, that they'll make these connections when they read this, and also then learn about a really incredible first lady who did a lot to change the role of the first lady. She introduced so much culture that I mentioned in the back matter into the White House. These dinners with guests of painters and artists and ballet dancers, and she brought the Mona Lisa to the White House, and she did so many things like that and then the White House restoration. So she really did an amazing thing. And then the ultimate was when President Kennedy was killed, how she researched how Lincoln was buried and that whole funeral, and modeled the president, another assassinated president. So I think that there's so much that she did, and that's another thing. I'm introducing them to a new generation. So
That's
that's
wonderful. Though, speaking of passions, I know that Jackie has been an inspiration and a role model for you for a long time. But I'm sure you already knew a lot about her, and you probably learned more things as you were doing the research for this book. So along the way, have you learned anything that surprised you, or anything that you wanted to include that didn't fit?
So since since I'm 8 years old, I've been aware of the Kennedys and very much influenced by President Kennedy as a child, and followed them for so many years. And then having a vast collection of books and have read a lot about them and Jackie. I think when I was doing this research, the one thing that it didn't really surprise me, but it's something new that I learned. I loved the fact that she wanted her authors to be the star, and that she didn't want the publicity herself. When a lot of the first books, some of the first books that she edited, they had her name on the cover that said edited by Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, or Jacqueline Onassis. And that stopped after a while. I think that she probably didn't really like that, because it was about the author. So that made me happy to learn that about her. So I think that was basic, because I just have read so much about her. So it's hard to know what, if anything, surprised me. And there are, some other things that surprised me, but it didn't have anything to do with this book. So.
Well, I have more questions, but there are some questions in our Q&A that I want to make sure I get to you also.
Okay.
And some of them are about kind of your relationship with Jackie. So Suzanne is asking, what was the hardest part about conveying a complex and fascinating person in prose and ideas that would be accessible to young children?
Well, that certainly was a challenge, because I'll tell you the story of how I got to even write this book. When after she died, I got this idea to write a novel about her, because when I wrote a lot of things. I wrote children's things. I've been writing forever, but I also was doing adult short stories, and then I had this idea for a novel. So, and of course, if you're writing for adults, as Suzanne knows, it's very different than writing for children. So along the way, while I was doing research for that novel, I spoke to Ted Sorensen, who was President Kennedy's speechwriter. And I also happened to know from my vacations on Martha's Vineyard, Margot Datz, who was the illustrator of Carly Simon's picture books that Jackie edited. So when I was talking to Margot about Jackie, she said, Ronni, you should really write a children's book. So then it was take that adult head and then write for children. So I then had to think about it, like, what would children be interested in? And I was doing that research, and I actually wrote a chapter book biography, because remember, this is 1994. And at that time, the picture book biographies, the way they are now, they didn't really have them then, because
Yeah,
I
it was
was
just David
librarian.
Adler, and they were so
Yeah,
formulaic, right?
yeah, exactly. And they were longer books. So I then worked on that, and I started to, and I wasn't able to sell it. And I sent it to an editor I knew, and he wasn't interested. So I put that aside for a while. And then, the more I became familiar with the picture book biography, I actually was writing another about somebody else. And, what you have to do is you think about, like, well, what are children interested in? Kids I think kids often want to know, well, how did that happen? And then, so in this story, like, how did it happen that she became an editor? Well, she started out, she loved to read, she did all these things, and that's what happened. And then 5 years ago, I may as well tell the whole story of this. And 5 years ago, I got this idea, and I actually have to thank Martha Olcott, one of the reference librarians at the Chappaqua Library, because I had a lot of books, but I needed these two articles, one from Ms. Magazine from the 70s when Jackie first started. She was interviewed by Publishers Weekly and Ms. Magazine. She didn't do a lot of interviews. So those were like big, and they were about her working in publishing. And so Martha helped me with that. And then that was 5 years ago, and it took a while to get this story down. And even with, thanks to the help of my editor, Nicole, because it was much more dense, but then we were able to like just really get it down to being this story that I think I'm hopeful, especially if I heard that a 3-year-old was wrapped in attention reading this and asking his mother to read it another couple of times, that I'm hitting the mark. And but it's harder to write for children than it is for adults. I can tell you that much. So good question. Who was that? Suzanne. Thank you, Suzanne. That was a great question.
All right, so Lisa has a question that I think might be kind of related. And she's asking, how did your journalism career and life in literature inform your writing of this book?
How did my journalism well, as a librarian, and Lisa's a librarian too, and she's a wonderful writer. People need to look for books by Lisa Rogers. She's amazing. And she has a new book out called Beautiful Noise that I highly recommend. And as a librarian, you're a researcher, okay? So so I always loved research. In high school, I was the editor and wrote articles in our high school newspaper. So it's your curiosity, and it's you asking questions, and it's all about, and any good writing, I remember even when I was helping kids do research, when I was a school librarian, you have to have good questions that you get the answers to. So I think all of that helped me. And I think Lisa, who's also was a journalist and a school librarian, that's kind of like you just go into that mode and think about how, what are you have to, what's the essential question? What do you want to know? And I think has helped. And it's just been my whole life of wanting to do research and asking questions and such. And the other thing is, I love learning about people. I love interviewing people. So that's it. Thank you for that question, Lisa. It was great.
Victoria has an interesting question. Which of the books that Jackie loved or edited do you think reflected something you thought was most interesting about her?
Well, since there were so many, I think there was her book about the Firebird and Russian folk tales that she did, because she was really interested in that. And there were, she did a lot of, like, she did the moonwalk, Michael Jackson, but I don't think that was really Jackie. She had such esoteric taste, and I think some of the ideas that she had, they didn't take because they just were too far out in some ways. So I think those books, I think the Sally Hemings, the fiction story about Sally Hemings, that was a big deal that she edited that book in the 70s. And, I also love that she did some picture books, not only Carly Simons, but Peter Cease, who's a fabulous, thank you, Robin, I love him too. And he said to me, because I contacted him after I wrote the book and told him about it, and he actually wrote a blurb for it. he said that he doesn't he said she was like a whisperer to the author, and she did his first book, which was The Three Golden Keys, which is about his life in Czechoslovakia. And so it's just I think it's books like that that she nurtured him, and that was one of the last books that she edited. So I think those are some of the books. She did a lot about French culture in the 1800s. It was all, and she has a French background, and she lived in Paris for a while, so she's, that's very important to her. So I think those are the books. So that was also a great question, Vicki. Thank you.
So Shira, age 8, has a question.
Okay, Shira.
How do you dedicate your book?
Oh, how did I decide on to dedicate it? So that's really an interesting question, and I'm really glad that you asked, because I dedicated that book to Elizabeth Hall. Elizabeth Hall, who's 94 years old, is a very dear friend of mine. I met her about 30 years ago when I moved to Westchester. She actually was married to Scott Odell, who wrote Island of the Blue Dolphins. She married him after he wrote that book, and she was a lot younger than he was. And she has been like my writing mentor since I've known her. And she always said to me, you can do it. She used to, because she wrote books from an animal's point of view. So when I was writing the Maggie May Pup Reporter columns, well, Maggie was writing it. Sorry, Maggie, she's sleeping. She can't hear this. So when Maggie was writing those, I asked, a lot of times I'd have Elizabeth read them to see if it really sounded like a dog, because she wrote books from an animal's point of view. So when I thought about, like, who am I going to dedicate this book to? And she has been such a dear friend and such a support. And she's always said, you are a good writer, because all writers don't think they're that good. And we question ourselves all the time. And so she always believed in me. And I thought that's also a gift I could give her now, as she is in her 9th decade. So that's how I chose Elizabeth. And then I said, and to, all the other, so she was my main, she was the main person. But that's a great question. And I think it's hard to decide, who to dedicate a book to. So, and it's also dedicated to all of you who love the joy of reading. So that's that. Thank you, Shira.
So that includes Shira.
Yes, Shira. So it's dedicated to you too, and your sister, and your mother and father, and everybody who's watching.
So it turns out that I have questions in 2 different places from 2 different Chappaqua librarians, both of them about how you and the illustrator Bats Langley came to work together and what that process was like.
So I love talking about that. So I have to say, I know I've mentioned it before, what a great editor Nicole Frail is. And Nicole, from the beginning, I have to say, I felt this was such an amazing experience. She, suggested Bats and let me see his work. And I actually had a voice in the decision of the illustrator. So then what happens is, and, in a lot of picture books, and I know this from other picture book writers, they don't really connect with the illustrator. You can give some illustration notes, but you have nothing to do with the illustrator. But in this case, I gave some illustration notes. And then, because I was sort of the Jackie expert and have this vast collection of books with tons of pictures, I was sending photographs from the books. Like, for example, I went to the the Sotheby's auction of her possessions after Jackie died, her children sold a lot of things, and they had an auction, and there was this huge catalog. And in the catalog, it had a lot of photographs of her apartment. So, for example, if you look at the cover, there's this horse statue. Well, Jackie had a horse statue on her piano. So I sent a lot of photographs to Bats and through Nicole, and because that's the way you're supposed to do things. But Nicole's going to find out something that she didn't know, that sometimes, because Bats and I were connected on social media, like on a weekend, he would say to me, he would text me and say, "Do you know what kind of birthday cake she liked?" And I said, "Yes, I do, because I have the book Cooking with Madam that was written by Marta Scubin, who was a nanny for the children, who then became a cook, and she wrote this book. So it had recipes, and it also had, let me find it, beautiful, well, you saw the picture of the birthday cake. It had, pictures of the birthday cake. So I sent them to him, and this birthday cake that you see in the book kind of looks like the birthday cake that Jackie had. And for those of you who live locally and can come on November 25th to my in-person book signing at Susan Lawrence in Chappaqua, there will be cake, birthday cake. So we worked that way, and it really was a marvelous collaboration. And like I said, I had, I would get to look at things. And for example, and this I know probably made Nicole crazy, but I was, at first, Bats drew her with shoes on her feet, but she used to read barefoot. And I was just like a dog with a bone about, but she has to have bare feet. You must take her shoes off. So he did. And it was just really marvelous. And I will say one other thing. A lot of people say to me, "Did anything surprise you about the illustrations?" Well, not that much, because I was collaborating and gave him book titles to put on all the books. But I want to say, and I think I told him this, that I adore this, how he did this last spread of framing her in the books. And I just thought that was brilliant. And she really did a beautiful job. And I just feel very lucky to have worked with him. So it was really great. Marvelous collaboration.
Some of the compositions of those illustrations are just, it's so dynamic. You really get this sense of movement just from where the pieces of the illustrations are.
Yes, I think this is going to be a good book for him in his career. That's my feeling, and I'm really happy for him.
Yeah.
So,
all right, we have a couple more questions in the Q&A, and then I have one more that I want to fit in.
okay.
So Alex is asking, what part of being a first-time author was the most surprising to you?
Well, that's a really good question. I think what surprised me, not a lot surprises me, because I've known so many children's book authors and heard so many stories and know so much about how this is done. But I think what surprised me is probably, well, maybe the fact that now as a children's book author, you have to either hire a publicist or be your own publicist. And fortunately, I have those good marketing skills. So that's my other full-time job, which I think I'm doing pretty okay at. So that's one thing. The other surprise is, is it a surprise? I just, it's just like, I have a book. I'm signed my first contract when I turned 70. So I think that was a nice surprise, Alex. And thank you for asking that, Alex.
That is a nice surprise. Congratulations.
Thank you. people tell me I'm not supposed to say how old I am, but I think I have a good story that if you don't give up and persevere, that it can happen to anyone. So
I think that is a good story. So we have another question in the chat as well. Since this is a children's book, if the reader asks, what does the word widow mean? What would you say?
well, a widow is a woman whose husband has passed away. That's what I would say, because that's what a widow is. And I think that's what I would say. That's a good question.
Yeah. All right. So John would like to know, what is the subject of your next book?
Well, I really can't tell you that, but I actually have two manuscripts that my agent will be sending out. One, I'll just tell you a little tiny bit. They're both, one's a man, one's a woman, and they are both really have interesting stories, life stories. And one of the things about writing a children's book that I've learned, and I even heard Emma Hamilton, who's Julie Andrews' daughter, who writes books, say, you need to have a personal connection. Somehow you have a personal connection. I definitely have a personal connection to Jackie in that I loved, I was admired the President Kennedy and her, plus I love writing and books. So I would say that the two books that I'm hoping will get sold are about people that I have some kind of connection with, not necessarily that I know them, but maybe I do. And that's that. So that's that. And I wish I could tell you, but I really can't because I'm not supposed to say anything. But there is one thing that I want to mention, and it was something that it wasn't really, it kind of should, I really need to say this. In order to include Sea Joy, the poem that Jackie wrote, I had to get permission. That because Nicole said to me, do you have permission? I said no. So I had to ask her daughter, Ambassador Caroline Kennedy. And Caroline Kennedy is in Australia. So I called the embassy in Australia one night and said, can I talk to Caroline, Ambassador Kennedy? And they said, no, you can, here's an email address. So I wrote an email telling them about my book that was being published by Sky Pony, what it was about, and may I use the poem. And I thought, well, how long is this going to take? And then 2 days later, I got an email from Rachel Floor, who's the executive director of the Kennedy Foundation. And she wrote that Ambassador Kennedy is happy to give me permission to reprint the poem. And I teared up when I got that email. I felt then so many emotions. One, I felt this made me know that I was meant to write this book. But what I also thought was, I really hope that this will make Caroline Kennedy happy to know that I'm introducing her mother to a whole new generation, and that they're going to read her poems, because poetry was really important to Jackie. And she did instill that in her children, because Caroline Kennedy has edited several books of poetry. One is the best love poems of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. And then there's another one, family poems and holiday. So she's done, I think, 4 or 5 books, and even an adult book on poetry. So that was very special and very meaningful to me. So
Yeah, that is a wonderful story. And the librarian strikes again, right? You will do your research to the opposite end of the world if you need to.
Exactly. Well, that's how I am. Like, nothing stops me. I'll call the White House if I have to, and which I've done in the past. So, but I wanted to mention something because Robin, you told me you were going to ask me a question about books that influenced me as a child.
Yes.
And so I'm a
That
librarian.
was going to be my last question, so this is perfect.
Okay. So, because that's something that Jackie wrote about. So I had a wonderful school librarian in at Circle Hill School in Comac, which doesn't exist anymore because they built too many schools in Comac and they had to knock them down. But Mrs. Galinsky gave me A Wrinkle in Time to read by Madeline Langell. And I love that book so that later on in my life, I actually wrote a science fiction fantasy that didn't get published. It almost did, but it didn't. And she also gave me The Island of the Blue Dolphins, which are two books I think every child should read. But then the other book that, even though I didn't read it as a child, a book that I think every person should read, adult or child, and that book is Dominic by William Steig. It's one of the most wonderful books about a dog who leaves home and goes on an adventure. It's all about life. Because of that book, I got to know William Steig and have a correspondence with him in the last years of his life. And
I feel like you're glossing over a pretty good story.
Do you want to hear the whole story of Dominic?
If there's a shortish version.
The short version is, this book I always loved. And I was doing an internship in administration in White Plains schools, and this assistant superintendent I worked with started telling me about these people who we were going to go to a committee meeting and they were all going to fight. And I said, oh, but they would like get each other in trouble. I said, oh, that's like the Doomsday Gang in Dominic. And she said, what are you talking about? So I went home and I bought her a copy of the book. A week later, she comes back and she says, I love this book. It's all about life. We were doing this thing in White Plains, the Year of the Reader, because that was the committee I was on that she was talking about. She says, I'm buying books for every teacher in new teacher, 100 copies of Dominic. So Elizabeth Hall, she comes into this story. When I told her this, she says, you should write to William Steig and tell him. So not being shy, I called Farrah Straus, the publisher, and said, how do I get in touch with William Steig? They said, send me the letter, I'll send it to him. Send it to him. So I did that. I told him how, the other thing is that superintendent then became the Deputy Secretary of Education for President Clinton. So I told, Judith Johnson, fabulous educator. And she was in White Plains, and then she also was in Peekskill as the superintendent, amazing woman. And so so I wrote to him and I said, that now that she works for President Clinton and she loved this book. And he said, well, if you get a copy to President Clinton, I'll sign it. So as soon as I got this letter from him, first it was a handwritten letter. I was like, oh my goodness, he wrote to me back from Boston. So I go and I got a copy. I had my own hardcover copy. I bought another copy of the book. And I sent it to him and asked him to sign it to President Clinton. And we got it to President Clinton. And that's an amazing story. So President Clinton moves to Chappaqua. And after that, and I say, I'm the one who sent you that book. And it was very funny. So I've given that book to adults, and it's an amazing story about life. And so William Steig, after that, we started corresponding, and then he passed away. He was in his 90s. But so that's my William Steig story, and Dominic and President Clinton all wrapped into one, and Elizabeth Hall. So it's full circle.
That is an action-packed story. And I second your recommendation of Dominic.
It's a great
for everyone. That is for all audiences. All right. Well, before we wrap up, I just want to let people know that if you haven't had a chance to stop by the library and pick up one of our craft kits, we do have just a few more. If you would like to create a little book with your own poetry, with your own illustrations, we created a little craft activity inspired by this book so that people could practice being poets just like Jackie, or writers just like Ronni.
And it's really an amazing craft. And I want to thank the children's librarians for their work in doing this. And I had a lot of fun, figuring out some of the things that they could write about. And they had some great ideas too. So it was a marvelous collaboration again with the children's with my fellow librarians. So
Yeah.
thank you so much, Robin.
And thank you. So we are actually we are raffling off 3 signed copies of the book, and that will be selected from people who registered for tonight's event. So keep an eye on your inbox in case you're one of our winners. And I want to thank Ronni Diamondstein for sharing her book and her time with us tonight. Thank you also to the Friends of the Miller House and Skyhorse Publishing for co-sponsoring tonight's program. And thanks everyone else for joining us. Ronni, is there anything else that you want to share before we go?
Wanted to say thank you so much. I hope that you will all love books like Jackie and read. And I just want to mention that, like I said earlier, local friends can, people can get the book, local people can get it at Scattered Books, at the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville. They have copies, so does the Katona Reading Room. And I'll be doing an in-person signing. People who got the books on Amazon, they can join me at Susan Lawrence from noon to 2 on November 25th. I'll be happy to sign your books, and there'll be bookmarks, other swag, and of course there'll be cake. So thank you so much for everyone who joined tonight. It was really great to see all of you, and my really heartfelt thanks to the children's librarians at the Chappaqua Library. Just amazing people. And if you haven't, those of you who if you have the chance to ever visit there, if you're not local, you should. It's one of the best libraries, and I always thought that even before I lived here. So thank you so much, Robin, and everyone.
Thanks everyone for joining us.